Lovely to see everyone. Oh, look, there's so many people signing in. This is fantastic. So we're right on 6:30 for our start. Michael, how are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks, Brooke. How are you going?
Excellent, excellent. I'll wait until a few more of our people have come in to go through the housekeeping for tonight, but it's really exciting to see as many turning up as they are.
Just let people know how many do we have joining in tonight's book club, Brooke?
So there's 63 people have booked, have registered, which is enormous, which also means that it's going to be hard to get everybody to say something. But I think some people will just be happy listening to the conversation, and then others will probably be quite high communicators. Now, if anybody would like to say anything to us, to actually talk during this rather than type a question in, please just let us know if you raise your hand.
And that's a button that you push, isn't it? Raising the hand, maybe.
Yes, so at the bottom of this, of everyone's screens, thank you, Lisa. Also, I'll just let you know that I'm sort of running a bit of the tech on the side here as well as talking. So if I occasionally look as though I'm distracted, it's just because I'm trying to get your messages across or make sure somebody's in safely. So, oh, someone's here from Central Queensland. Hello, Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. Thanks for coming from Central Queensland. That's lovely.
Okay, so I'd just like to read a quick acknowledgement. So Yarra Valley Writers Festival respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of this land that we're on, as the custodians of this land. We pay respect to all Aboriginal community elders, past and present, who have resided in the area and have been an integral part of the history of the region. I think a lot of people have been part of Sorry Day acknowledgements yesterday, and also the Reconciliation Week, different events that have started as of today, which I don't know whether I'm acknowledging something that makes me seem stupid or unaware, but when Tony and I talked about this date, neither of us twigged that we were putting the white girl into Reconciliation Week. It was only, much later that we realised what we'd done. So we've chatted to Tony about that over the last couple of days, and he's just requested that we don't go in the discussion about Reconciliation Week too much tonight, because he just feels that it's such a big topic and not necessarily directly relates to his book. If someone has some questions around Sorry Day, he thinks that they probably relate to what's going on in the white girl more, and he's happy to discuss how the white girl issues in the white girl resonate with what happened with Sorry Day. I hope that's all right with everyone. Now, down the bottom, you'll see a little icon that says raise your hand. And if anybody would like to say something, actually voice a question, or actually just tell us something about what you thought of the novel, or what somebody else has said, please just raise your hand and I can actually let you in and you can speak with us rather than just typing all of the questions. So I think that's probably all from me in the very beginning. And Michael, would you like to say a few things?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this is very exciting for us at the Yarra Valley Writers Festival. Thank you so much for all you lovely people from all over Australia, we're discovering, who've agreed to participate in our first book club. And what I want to start with, and such an appropriate week that we're doing it, Tony Birch's fifth, I think, novel, The White Girl. Most of us, I'm sure, have, or almost all of us, I'm sure, have read the book. It's what I would call structurally a very straightforward narrative, a story of Australia's past, of our recent Indigenous past. It's the story of a grandmother and her granddaughter who need to leave this small where is it? Who knows? I'll ask Tony about why he's so non-specific about placing it geographically and in time as well later. But they need to get out of their town, and it's about their journey and it's about their escape. Somehow I kind of feel it's a little bit like Australia's escape from that world too, that world of the past that we were locked into for so many years and have only recently emerged on in the terrible, terrible, disgraceful way that we've treated the first peoples of this country who've been there for. Every time an archaeologist digs, the extent of Indigenous occupation in this country goes back another 10,000 years. I mean, I think we're up to, I mean, I'm sure you people know more than I, but sort of 60,000 years is the figure I've got, and how we ignored and degraded and simply didn't acknowledge the cultural richness of this country from the very brief, from the time we began our very brief occupation of it from 1788. But it's a story of, it's not a story about those times, it's really a story of our times, I think, and the bridge between those times and our times, set, we think, perhaps somewhere in the early 1960s. The publicity for the book says that the story starts, I think, Brook, it was 1963. Now,
it opens in 1963.
Yes. I know the publicity says it, but I'm not sure if it says that in the actual book. Please correct me. But it's a fabulous, rollicking mixture of, like, it's an escape story. It's a story of oppression. It's a story of strength. It's kind of like a Western, you know. There are the good guys and the bad guys, and there are the protagonists, these fabulous two women, Odette and Sissy, and their family relationship, which is, well, even in this incredibly troubled world environment that they live in, their relationship is so strong. It's so indelible. It's so unmalleable. It can't be broken under any circumstances, which is the cause of these two women's escape from this town and to escape into a new reality, which is what they do in heading for this unnamed capital. I love how Tony just calls it the capital city. He doesn't say it's Sydney or Brisbane or Hobart or Perth or Adelaide. It's the capital city. Let's think about why he does that. I'm very curious about structurally why he does that. But I found it a really fascinating, rollicking read, and so colourful and visceral, and took us back to a time in our very recent past. And so recent that we can't even imagine Australia's like, many of us can't. I can't imagine Australia was actually like that, but of course it was. Look, they're my opening comments, and of course all through this we want to open to you too. Brook, what did you think of the book?
Well, I'm pretty sure we read the same book, but
oh, I see. Yes.
But I didn't find it so much a rollicking ride. And I get what you're saying with feeling like it's almost, you know, the Australian version of a Western. But for me, that was in the landscape more than anything, because I think Tony creates such, you know, he's so good at creating place. Like, I could see everything. I could feel it. I felt like I could walk around the corner and see it, and it would exist for me whilst I was in it. And I would think I was struck by that. I was struck by how clear it was where they were. But I think I always also felt as though there was a horizon, like that the way that this world, their world, actually had quite a closed horizon to it. And it felt... it was large in terms of its richness and its purpose and their and the depth of how they communicated and you know, and Odette's sense of talking with her elders, whether they be past or not. I mean, there's so much of that about it, that there was a richness in that life, even though it was so simple and felt so barren and dry. But I thought...
I just say, I know exactly what you mean about that closed horizon, because this is, and I think how Tony simply in his narrative describes so viscerally the back blocks where the black people lived. They had to live. They couldn't live anywhere else, in these shacks on the edges of the town. You didn't even really get a sense of what the what the town, if there was any nicer part of the town. You didn't get a sense of what that was like. You only get a sense of these awful kind of back blocks, and I can really see it, and I can see these buildings, and I can smell it, and I can smell the kind of the animal refuse, and I can smell the kind of weird smell from that wonderful character's junkyard sort of across the way, and the sounds of it, and the hardness and the dryness of it. But that was their world, because they legally couldn't leave it.
No, I think that's right. But I think my point is that I loved the way that it was created by him in that way, and that we were in their framework. We were within Odette and Sissy's visual as well as lived framework, whilst, you know, for so much of the novel. And it wasn't until we were sitting on the train with her and they were acting out their different characters, and somebody else that had lived in the town that they'd never seen and didn't even know the Canes, because the Canes had fallen from grace. And clearly that person's sense of that town was like a different world. They may as well have been in a different world. And it became very apparent there that we were participants in the one small view that these people were allowed. But it was also, I think it was such a gentle and loving novel at the same time. And also that, like, the relationship between Sissy and Odette. I mean,
well, that's what makes it so loving, because, as I said before, that's the spine, isn't it? That's the bedrock of this whole story, the strength of these two women's relationship. And just to that, sorry, go on. Now, we should, if anyone wants to jump in.
Yes, anyone have people can disagree with us, please. In fact, you probably do disagree with us, so let us know how or what you were thinking. Oh, Lisa, yes. To me, it was a story about connection to the elders through the visit to the cemetery, the connection of traditional owners and settlers, the relationship with Millie and her husband. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yes,
The connection of Odette to her granddaughter, and the connection of the people who pulled them from the abyss. And Odette was not stuck there. She wanted to stay, but the connection to her family made it so that she could not. So that's actually what, thank you, Lisa, that's beautiful.
That's a fabulous observation, yeah.
You know, it was about connection. And it was also about, you know, Odette's resilience. It was extraordinary. I mean, I was so uncomfortable around every time a Cane character came onto the page.
Oh, I know.
I was, you know, I dreaded them opening their mouth. I could feel myself like tightening up at what was going to happen next. And then you kind of always knew what was happening, because it sat in the burning, like was in the back, that you were going to find out the dreadful truth about Sissy. But then Odette's way she handled that and absorbed it and acknowledged it as a challenge, because that man's blood was in her granddaughter, like that this person that was almost like pure evil. But in her granddaughter, and she had to process that.
But I actually do think Tony writes with a lot of hope as well, and even the darkest chapter, the darkest parts of it. Take the Cane family, and I love the biblical kind of. I'll ask about that, the biblical reference of Cain and Abel and the brothers and all that, but the brother George. See, he's the nice brother who wants to change. He wants to break away from this awful family and this awful, ghastly traditions. He and to me, he actually represents what's happening in the outside world, this momentum towards change. But of course, you know, I think it's Harry, the junkyard owner. It's too late in the Keynes family's case. Their sins are too indelible, and George, as that I think it's Harry, the junkyard character, says, you know, they have to pay for their sins. But I find no, it's what Lisa said. That sense of connection is very complex and is all the way through the book. And I hadn't even remembered the connection with the ancestors, which of course opens it, and it's so important.
And Annie has just made a great point. She said to her, it's the story of so much, but mostly it's celebrated the strength of women of all ages, how women in their minds and their bodies, they hold the pain and they hold the stories and they hold strength, and mostly they hold the love. And it was her favourite read of 2019, which is, I can completely understand. I did wonder, and I'd really like to hear from those of you out in the audience as well. Well, you're not really audience, you're meant to be part of this. We're all in this conversation. Who do you think it was written for? Like, I was, you know, I would find myself stepping out of the story occasionally and just wondering who, if Tony had an audience in his mind when he was writing it, and not for any particular reason, but I felt it was a story that was for an audience. And then that thought extended a little bit from me to think it actually was a really quite an oral story, or an oral story. Like, I think there's almost any part of that book, you could pick it up and read it, and it would work so beautifully as a story told to you. You don't, some books, you know, they need to be read, and that is, their beauty is in sitting with them quietly or independently and taking them away and mulling over them on your own and dissecting them, you know, in the dark almost, you know what I mean? But it's, or falling into them in such a way that you're so into the book that you couldn't imagine anyone participating in it with you. But I did feel with The White Girl that it was written with a voice that could be read. And I did wonder if anyone else felt that or heard that when they were reading it. And
do you say that because I know what you mean? And is that because there's such a strong visual element to it?
I think there's a really strong visual element to it, and I think it's also just in the tone and the structure of the book. Like, there's a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of, and when I say simple, I mean, I don't mean simple in that way that it's plain English, you know, in terms of, it's not constructed to be a piece of high fiction that you know, it's not written for a writer, so to speak. It's a book that is written for people to enjoy and to get into and to actually understand and absorb the story. It's not, you know, there's no pretense around his writing at all.
Lisa's given us another comment there. What does she? And from Marie, hello.
Oh, great. So, yes, for George, his brother, of course, and that doctor was such a beautiful character. Yeah. The doctor that sat against the, you know, that hellish policeman. And, you know, there's still probably remote communities in Australia that, you know, would unfortunately have people like that. But I think they existed in the 60s a lot more, and they exercised the power. Oh.
And I know for a fact that there are a lot of Holocaust survivors that actually came out to Australia and were appalled about, because I actually went to school with one of them, Herbert Bauer. He was an Austrian Jewish refugee that came to Australia after the war, fully qualified doctor, and he, because he was an enemy alien, he was sent to look after the Aboriginal people in the sticks, and he was shocked by the treatment of them. But he's a great character, the doctor, and how Sissy, or is it Odette, notices the number from Auschwitz or whatever on his arm, and he knows what oppression looks like because he's felt it himself, and so he has huge empathy with these women.
Like, he wrote the letter designed to help her. He took the blame for her not getting, you know, her correct papers through, because he's, you know, the letter that he'd written assumed that he should have really done that, and sorry that he hadn't. Like, there was such compassion in that moment. But I mean, and was that because you have to understand, you know, the need for compassion before you can deliver it? You know, I don't know whether that was the point, but I just think that, you know, he showed beautiful compassion in that moment, because it wasn't even asked for.
Mm. Go on. I think, has someone contributed as well?
Yeah, so Simon's saying, I don't know whether people have got the chat up, but it was like Simon Wagner saying that it was like sitting with his elders and having that connection back to them through this book. He's a Maori Irish woman, and as an adult, my family has spread out over many countries, but this story spoke to me in a voice from my elders. That's lovely.
We should remind people that if they want to actually speak, they can put their hand up.
Oh, hang on, Grace Birch is trying to. Sorry, I'll just let Grace talk. Hi, Grace. Can you hear us?
Come in, Grace. Maybe Grace has muted herself, perhaps.
Oh, no, I think it's a connection issue. I can hear that that Grace did try to say something then. I don't know whether it's my connection or Grace's connection.
Oh, well.
So Karen's saying that the difference between the kindness of the people in the capital city and the small town was quite stark. It absolutely was. I mean, is that a comment around education? Is that, or, you know, that's the other?
Oh, sure, but I think, as I just going back to the whole city country thing, I mean, that's when I think that's our payoff almost, when he comes, when the characters come to the city, because you sense that old world back in what was the name of the town? Gatland. It's such a good name. See, that's like a Western town, Gatland. Gatland, the sheriff of Gatland. But it's not. It's. I always think it's somewhere around Dubbo, I reckon. I'll ask Tony about that. But when they come to the city, for people for the most part, you sense that whole Gatland world is starting to just kind of crack. Lisa said, I thought Dubbo too. Good on you, Lisa. I mean, poor old Dubbo. I'm sure Dubbo hasn't deserved all this. But it's sort of Western New South Wales, we think. We think they're coming to Sydney, even though there's no direct reference to it. But you sense that when they come to the capital city, that's the beginning of the evolution that led to, because they're alluding to things like the constitutional referendum, where in the 67 referendum, and that was seen as such an insurmountable step, even a few years before it actually passed, and passed easily, one should remember. Yeah. But back then, and in places like Gatland, it was seen as such a terrible threat. And there's that, the villain policeman, what's his name, Lowe, he really just sort of loses it at the end in the Sydney police station, and says, yes, but the country needs people like us to keep them in their place. And there's this petty clerk in the welfare board, and the powers shift, and he says, well, you're not relevant anymore, mate. Times have moved on, and we've actually learned, you're going to learn that the power that you've wielded in this country over these people no longer exists.
Yeah, I think, and he didn't ever go back to that town, which we find out at the end. So he, for whatever reason, when he went to the city to find Odette, like, he stayed there. He didn't, so whether he had a breakdown because the system was changing and he couldn't cope with that, we don't know. But, because remember when Sissy goes back to take Odette home, you know, that's sort of figuratively and literally, you know, they said that he'd never come back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so is that an acknowledgement that the world had changed so much, and he hadn't probably seen it. I think that's what happens in remote Australia being so large geographically. You know, if you're stuck in a backwater somewhere that has very little infrastructure and attendance by the outside world, you can actually,
Australia back then, when the distances and the cultural influences are so few.
It's a bit Conrad in that way, that sort of heart of darkness theory.
Very hard. Yes, it is. It's very Conrad. Now, is there a way that Valerie said, I can't see the chats posted. Is there a way that people can actually see the chats posted, or that can't be done at the moment?
No, we can write. So it just means that we just need to keep for making sure that we talk to them. We can write to everything. To everyone. I don't know.
Sorry about that, Valerie, for this.
Sorry, one of the teething issues. And as I said in the email, we will ask you all for your feedback after this, as this is our first go at a book club and the first time doing it as a webinar. We've been doing most of our activity through meetings, and I can't even tell you why I made the decision to quickly flip to a webinar for this. It was completely random. So let's just see whether it was a good idea or not, but let us know.
Mm-hmm. Samantha's texted, trying to read the city versus country comment about kindness. There is safety in numbers and much easier to show kindness when you won't be judged by the local loudmouth, narrow-minded bigot for the rest of your, I've lost it there. It's jumped the page. Like loudmouth for the rest of your days. Living in a small community requires a level of nuance you don't need in a big city. Okay, that's a very nuanced comment indeed. People can speak though, can't they? So if people are being shy, they can put up their hand. Just remind where the hand button is. We can actually hear your voices. If you put your hand up button and would like to speak, would love to hear you. Just remind Brook people where that.
Down on the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat button, a hand up button, and a Q&A button, which you might have to put your cursor onto the screen to get that to come live, if that makes sense. And that's where, if you can't see the chat, if you double click on the chat icon, it should pop out for you, so you can see it that way.
And of course, we will be joined by Tony just in a few minutes now, but if you did want to jump in before that, you're very, very welcome to do so. Yes, it's, I'm always amazed that, I'm sorry, go on.
Marie's going to have a chat. Hello, Marie.
G'day, how are you?
Hi,
Good,
Marie.
how are you?
Thanks for calling in.
Hi, I'm a secondary school teacher, and I'm actually teaching the white girl to my Year 9 English class at the moment, remotely.
Oh, great.
And I've got to say that I have actually, for the first time, been reading it with my students, and I don't know the end. We're up to chapter 15. And I actually have a connection with Tony as well. We taught his beautiful girls at our school, and we've taught his short stories before as well. He's just a magnificent writer to study for young people. One of the things that our kids have really picked up on is the terror of the town.
Yeah.
And the middle ground characters, like O'Shea, who is sort of trapped in his position. And the other thing that they really picked up on was the symbolism of the river and how
Of course, the symbolism of the river. Listen, tell me, what do you make of the symbolism of the river, Marie?
Well, I've just read about 20 responses on that this afternoon. I think it's beautiful. It's that connection to a reciprocal relationship with nature that was lost after invasion. The river is also, the river was the dividing. People lived under the bridge, the bridge. The other side of the bridge is where you sent the black fellas.
Yes.
So delineation. The delineation, yeah.
And there's wonderful that sip of red wine was noted, Brooke, by everyone concerned. Thank you very much.
It's a book club. You should all be out there sipping red wine. You're the only one not. You don't know.
Don't worry, if we were in a real flesh and blood book club, we'd all have a couple of bottles of wine around us. Don't you worry. But, well, I've lost my track of what I was going to say about the river. The river was so important, yeah.
I guess also the terrific sort of extension of that in our current day when our Murray River doesn't even open up into the sea anymore.
Yes.
And there was a whole lot of stuff in the news about that the other day. So it's just a beautiful text to study in so many ways. So for me, that's my audience, but I also just love reading Tony Birch as well. So thanks.
And somebody else. Oh, no, thank you for coming in, Marie, but also just to sort of back up what you're saying or refer back to it is Barb was saying she's teaching English. She's writing. She says writing accessible English is a great skill, and it's not easy to craft what can be described as simplicity. And I think it's a really, it's a very good point to make that at the moment you can say something is beautiful but simple, I mean, that takes a lot of work and a lot of attention to detail.
Well, Sarah also will concur that her comment is completely agree with your comments earlier about the language. I think it's great the language is so accessible whilst at the same time exploring complex issues. I teach VCE as you do, Marie. Yes, you too teach VCE? Maybe you're not in Victoria.
So
and recommending to some of my students. Have they enjoyed the book, Marie?
Oh, I think I'm off mute. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I think, it's a bit tricky teaching a text on Zoom. I can tell you that for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But I got lots of thumbs up the other day. Of course, they hate you ruining a story by deconstructing every aspect of it.
Oh, I know.
But their writing is proving that they've engaged with it, so it's terrific.
All right. Thank you, Marie.
And Cheryl has something to say. Thanks so much for joining us, Marie.
I just wanted to comment, going back a little bit to structure.
Yes.
I noted, and audience, I felt as if Tony was really writing, just wanting to get some important messages across, obviously. But one of them, which he bookended his story with, was trauma, transgenerational trauma. The Cane boys, although in one sense they epitomised pure evil, we did read about their mother and her desperately sad inability to connect and engage with her little boys. And then, of course, at the other end, at the end of the novel, there's Millie, who could still sense the evil out there, the bad people.
That's very beautifully observed. I hadn't thought that.
Transgenerational trauma.
Hello, Tony.
How the trauma lives on and on. The Cane boys had no idea. Sorry, go on.
I was just saying to Tony, he's just joined us. And I was just going to mention that Cheryl's having a bit of is talking about the fact that she noted the transgenerational trauma all through the book. Like it's come up in so many ways.
Yeah, I actually heard that.
Yeah,
I heard that, and I heard the earlier comment as well about the issue.
What have I got to do?
Sorry.
That's all right. You're right.
I heard that, and I think that the issue there is, of course, that we have to come to understand why Lila, the daughter, has left the town. And the issue, I think, around Millie at the end is really important to note, because it was brought up earlier about, what happens to Sergeant Lowe. And in the drafting of the novel, in an earlier version, I actually had him killed. I wanted to get rid of him. So it was the writer wanting revenge. I wanted revenge. But the whole notion that he is out there, so you are right, he never goes back to the town. but I did want to have this sense that Millie recognises that this evil presence is still out there, because one of the issues I wanted to convey there is that not so much or only that Lowe may be still out there, but this sense of pervading evil of a particular psyche in men, in particular men, they're never going to let up. And one of the things that we note is that whether we're talking about the 1960s or current day, whatever changes and whatever progress we hope to make, there will always be individuals, there will always be people out there who have a very different objective for Aboriginal people. So his sort of looming haunting of the landscape was really important to leave that at the end of the book. And I heard you say earlier, well, you're not sure if you had a breakdown or where, that's fine, because I in this case, I certainly wouldn't want the reader to feel lost, but the notion that the reader might consider, well, what happened to Lowe? Where is Lowe? I actually like that. I like that because I think it leaves you with a lot to think about as a reader, rather than just, as I did in the earlier draft, had someone hit him over the head and kill him.
Well, I like that too, Tony, if I can say, because you get the sense that that encounter in the capital city, which we assume is, well, we won't assume anything, but it's the capital city, when Lowe comes to town and he's almost been deranged by his obsession.
Yeah.
And he realizes, when I was saying before, that the world shifted and he didn't realize it because he goes into that office thinking that he's still the top dog.
Yeah.
And the clerk is the person that removes his power, which sends him mad. And he goes back to where, and it's like this, maybe I think maybe he tops himself, but his ghost is still sort of brooding over the town in the hills or something like that. It's very powerful.
Well, there is a scene in the novel that people will know that toward the end of the novel, when Lowe goes to Jack Haynes and Elmer's house, and Jack comes out and he says to him, the copper says, well, basically, I've only got to show that, you're neglectful and I can still get these kids. As he walks away, Jack picks up an axe, and Elmer puts her hands on Jack's shoulder and basically says no. In the earlier draft, Jack followed him up the street and just went whack.
Right, okay.
Then what happened to Jack? I was so pleased he didn't do that, because
And also it would mean, as Elmer points out rightly, an Aboriginal man hitting a policeman over the head with an axe in 1967. Yeah, this is before Ronald Ryan was hung, so he would have certainly been hung. So it would have been also too simplistic an outcome. But as I said, I got stuck with this policeman for a year, so in the end I just wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
I had enough of him.
But I was so pleased when Jack didn't do that. I was almost cheering on the side for Elmer, because you could understand why he wanted to. It was palpable. It was like, we all want him dead, Jack. We all want him dead. We want you to live, and we need you to exist.
Right. That's right. And that, it's the quiet but firm voice of his wife that that's where reason comes from. And I think that, I love Jack as a character because it's reflected earlier in the novel when he first meets Odette in the railway station, and he sort of has this sort of boastful exchange about him, getting an exemption certificate and talking about himself as good as a white man. We know that he already understands the humiliation of that. And then when the policeman with the immigration officers comes to the table, he then further humiliates Jack. So the tragedy of this is that, grown Aboriginal men, very strong, powerful Aboriginal men, often found themselves humiliated by authorities who had total control over them. And the circumstances of that would be you'd either, as in Jack's case, to keep your mouth shut, or as many cases, not keep your mouth shut, and you'd find yourself in further trouble. So it's a terrible position to put anyone in, to be either humiliated through silence or to react with, in my terms, understandable violence. Either way, that person is going to suffer greatly. So that's a classic example of the power imbalance in society.
Well, and I think that you really...
Sorry, Brook.
There was that... And I think Odette's character especially, but even the way that she communicated with Harold and her empathy with George, and she could see the underdogs or the people that were... She knew, she could feel what, the position they were in, but she couldn't attend to that because of her position, but it's that living with, even if you're not directly under threat at that moment, like just knowing that you could be at any given moment, you could lose. You know, so
I mean, that's how surveillance works. And in the case of Aboriginal people, the shocking reality is that the various Aborigines acts, you know, the various acts that control people, they could be very arbitrarily applied and with no consistency, so that a person literally, and it's interesting, I'm a historian, I did a PhD in history, and sometimes when you talk of these contradictions, is that people will say, oh no, hang on, the law said this would happen and that would happen. Well, that's what the law said on paper, but the law was applied in very different ways. So, yeah, an Aboriginal person could find themselves living with a relative sense of freedom one day and having that freedom completely removed the next day without any change to the existing law, just how it would be applied. So a really good example that I know, because I did a lot of, when I was teaching at Melbourne University, I did a lot of work on Aboriginal women writing, particularly from reserves and missions in Victoria. And what would you find? So there is a law that applies to women. It might be about movement. It might be about ration. It might be about which family members can live on a reserve. And basically a local policeman might say to that woman, or in writing, look, you've got to keep your head down. If you start demanding particular things, your rights, well, we will apply the law a lot more strictly. So it was really strong attempts to keep Aboriginal people in our place. And the outcome of that is, of course, that people sometimes did, but when people demanded rights, as they also did, it could be the case that the police would come down very heavily on people, or would be instructed by the Chief Secretary of the Parliament here in Melbourne to speak to a local guardian. And when we say guardian, the local guardian was either a policeman or a justice of the peace. And again, depending on the relationship of that individual with the local Aboriginal community, you could have a relatively benevolent person, or you could have, as in the case of Sergeant Lowe, a really, basically someone bordering on being a psychopath and applying the law in a very draconian, very violent way.
However, though, and Lisa brings up this question to you, Tony, and it's a very good one, because it really is such an important aspect of the novel. I was pleased with the ending being uplifting, Tony. Why did you end with hope and not despair?
Oh, well, I always end with hope. I think that's a really good question. I think there are two reasons. One is that I didn't want to write a violent novel, although there's the violence sort of is always circulating on the edges of the story. Essentially, I wanted to write a story about tenderness and about love between women and in this case, a granddaughter. I also wanted to commemorate and pay my respect to Aboriginal women who have really led these community struggles to keep family together for hundreds of years in Australia. So I wanted to show the love and tenderness and courage of someone like Odette Brown. And I didn't want to do something, Michael, and I'm sure you would know this, Michael, being of a similar age, and we probably both sort of watched the same films when the renaissance of the Australian film industry from the 1970s. One of the problems of the Australian film industry is that invariably, and this is until recently, if an Aboriginal woman appeared in a film, and usually a period drama, she was very rarely named, and she was likely to be raped or murdered or both. So that the representation of Aboriginal women has, until recent years, been quite negative. So I wanted to make sure that I wrote a novel that was about that love. And secondly, the ending is uplifting to, in a sense, pay value to that, so that when Sissy goes back to the town with Odette, or taking Odette home, and she meets up with Millie, these are three women, and by this time, of course, Sissy is a young woman herself. It's to show the resilience, the courage, and the ability to survive in these women. So in the end, I would see it as a quiet triumph, in the sense that these women are clearly the heroes of the book. Yes.
To me, a lot of the hope comes in the sense that you create, Tony, of the world shifting, of everyone's world shifting. Mm-hmm. And it's as if by them by the getting on that train and breaking that hermetic seal that's kept them in this world for generations, it's almost that kind of starts to spill into, because they go to the city and people are more respectful of them, some anyway, and there's the talk of what's obviously the beginning of the campaign for the referendum in 1967, which was seen as absolutely out of this world, you've got to be crazy, insurmountable just a few years before, and yet it happened.
Yeah, a couple of things there, Michael, is that one of the things that people may not realise, so if you look at, say, relatively strong urban Aboriginal communities, say particularly in Redfern in Sydney and around Fitzroy in Melbourne, is that it wasn't that when Aboriginal people came to the city that they didn't experience racism at all, but it's remarkable the extent to which those communities strengthened, and they lived, I think, with greater autonomy than they had previously. So while they would have been dealing with individual instances of racism in the cities, there was also a great sense of community which sustained people, and really strong and vital political movements came out of those communities. That's the first thing. But the other thing that Jack says, which is quite interesting, is that even though in the city it wasn't common to see a lot of Aboriginal people, Jack does say at one point you can vanish into the metropolis, and in some senses that, of course, is another reality. So that if you're an Aboriginal person living in a country town, it's most likely that the local policeman, who himself, as in the case of Shay in the novel, the policeman Shay, may have grown up in the same town. Not only do they know you, they know your family, they know your whole history. So there's a whole sense of being completely under the sort of spotlight of authority.
He's so tragic, Shay, isn't he? He's so tragic.
Yeah, and I think that he is tragic, and I think...
Beaten down by the system, beaten down by his alcoholism, just beaten down. But he's a good man underneath.
Well, see, the thing about Shay, which I wanted to convey, is that as a child, as we know in the novel, not only was he friends of these same people who stood by and saw their children taken, he does say to Odette at one point, when I was a kid, I thought I was a blackfellow, and she said, so did I. And there's that moment that they recall when he, as a child, and Odette as a child, are wrestling on their front lawn, and the mum comes home and looks at this with disgust. So it's about the innocence of the child being shattered by the adult who understands how race works in a country town. And I think it is a tragedy, so that you would hear many, many stories from Aboriginal people who had real strong friendships with kids when they were growing up together in country towns, and then at a certain point, usually into adolescence or high school, it changed. And that changed because there's either an awareness in a person that, you know, things have to be different, or they're told so. And I won't name this person because of privacy, but here's a tragic story. I know a very, very important Aboriginal person with a very, very strong national profile who's older than me, so a person in their 70s, who told me that they went back to the town. This person went back to the town he'd been born in a couple of years ago, and for the first time in his life, he was invited into the home of a white person. So he had lived all his life in this town and never been into the home of a white person. And even when he was invited into this home as an older man, he said he did so with great hesitancy. So these sort of silent barriers of a sort of social apartheid are still with a lot of people. And while it was never written down that you can't bring an Aboriginal kid home, children would have known inherently that these barriers existed, and they're shocking barriers to have to live with.
And they were often not voiced. Like, you know, the adults didn't have to say anything. It was almost in the, I grew up in a town, as we discussed earlier, that, you know, I grew up with Aboriginal kids, and Luena Powell was my really good friend and used to come and have sleepovers. But I remember looking back, it wasn't until I looked back at, because my father was incredibly embracive of everybody, but my mother was a Melbourne city girl living up there, and I just knew at the time that there was something that it just wasn't comfortable for her.
Yeah.
You know, it was in the 70s, and it was, and you know, Dad and I just ignored her and just kept going. And Louina used to stay a lot, but even as a primary school age kid, I was aware that there was something. She was having a conversation without me, if you know what I mean.
And everyone, it's that a wonderful Australian anthropologist, Michael Taussig, has said the strongest street secrets are the public secrets. We all know, but no one says anything. So there's this palpable sort of energy and vibration. So in a lot of these cases, everyone knows what's really going on, but no one says what's really going on. And the tension in that is so strong, because it's about people not being able to utter words like, you know, a kid saying, why is this happening? Why is this wrong? And a parent saying, let's not talk about it, because once you open up that Pandora's box of racism, there are real issues for people to have to deal with, which a lot of people don't want to have to confront.
Well, and I think that this is a really good time to bring in a really lovely contribution from Maggie. If I can read it to you. A massive thank you, Tony, and it wasn't violent, the book, I think. As an expat Canadian, I have seen a parallel universe over there. Last year, I spent a month in Alice Springs and, against local advice, walked around the streets in the evening. I observed youngsters being photographed, stopped, etc. I was caught in the moment with an extended Indigenous family outside the cinema. They couldn't afford to see top-end wedding. Each time I lingered, and as a mature-age woman, I was invited to stay and chat, sit on the benches with them. Their stories spoke of resilience, a clear awareness of their position in the life of the town. One of the elders took me with her several times, and it is crushing and humbling to witness their clear-eyed view of what has happened to their people and the tasks they have before them. They're very aware and have contact with Indigenous communities around the globe, something few white fellas know about. I simply don't know how to deal with the impact of that contact. This book helps. That's a lovely.
I mean, just for Maggie's sake, I mean, if she wants to jot something down, if she wants to chase up an essay of mine called Two Fires in the Anjan, you can Google that. The reason I say that is for Maggie, I was in Canada, Turtle Island in 2017, and I was at the Banff Centre, and the first thing that happened when I got off the airplane in Vancouver and picked up the Saturday newspaper was to read about the death of a First Nations young woman on the side of a highway. And then while I was there, I was reading stuff around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reading stuff about the Royal Commission into the murder of Aboriginal women and girls in Canada, reading stuff about the residential school system. And what I'd say is the parallels between a colonial society such as Canada and Australia are remarkably similar. And that essay is actually about my experience of going to another country on the other side of the world and running into myself almost, or running into a history which we know here. So this is a global issue and has been historically a global issue, whether it be First Nations in Turtle Island, USA, in New Zealand. These are very common histories of the abuses of Indigenous people.
Tony, I just want to talk about, I'm fascinated by the specificity of the book.
That's it.
You don't name, I'll get there eventually. You don't name you name a town, but it's not a real, or it might be, but I don't know where. You don't name the state. You're vague on what actual year we get a sense, and even you don't call it Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne. It's the capital city. Now, what was the reason for that?
Well, I mean, I think when I was looking before, someone said, I think it's Dubbo.
Yeah. I said Dubbo because because some parts, I don't know why I said Dubbo.
Look, there's something beautiful about that, because everyone has claimed that Dean is their town, which is a great success. Look, the main reason is pretty simple, Michael, is that it's certainly an experience of what I would call Southeastern Australia. So if someone said, where could this town be? It could be anywhere in the northwest of Victoria, which people often forget is desert. So once you get up into that northern corner, so that northwestern corner, of Victoria, through Western New South Wales and into southwest Queensland, you're dealing with, in some ways, very similar country. So in the sense of the country, it could be in any of those locations. But the main point is this. the historical experience of Aboriginal people in those free states in particular, although not exclusive, and certainly across the South Australia, is very common in the sense of how legislation works, how this arbitrary justice works, and how some of the so-called caste legislation and exemption acts work. So I wanted to write a book that Aboriginal people reading the book not only could get a sense that they know a story similar to this, but it could be their story, or it could be a family story, or it could be a local story. So it was quite specific in that sense, so that I wanted to make sure that people could feel a greater attachment to the story than you might get if you said, okay, it's Dimboola in Victoria, or it's the back of Brook, or Dubbo, as someone said. So that was quite purposeful. I did spend time in a country town with a similar layout, which I won't name, doing a lot of walking. I do a lot of what I call observational work to get a sense of the divisions in a town. But that was the main issue. And then with the capital, people are suspected that it's Sydney and people are suspected it's Melbourne. I have to admit, it's sort of, in my head, it was a bit of both. There is a sort of sense, well, it's probably Melbourne, because when Odette has that terrible experience of going to the museum and seeing the cast of the skeletal remains of an Aboriginal woman, that was the experience of the shocking experience of Aboriginal people in Melbourne up until 1969, going into the Victorian Museum in Russell Street, or in
Wow.
in
I
Russell
would have
Street,
seen it myself in that case.
and seeing the cast of Truganini. Now, it's not her actual skeleton, it's one of the copies they made, but of course that wasn't known to anyone going in there. So I drew on that horror of that experience of people having to confront that. But again, it could be Sydney, it could be Melbourne, and it's definitely not Adelaide.
No, it's not Adelaide. It's not Brisbane either.
No.
Because I mean, I talked about it earlier, Tony, is I found your placemaking extraordinary. Like I was there, like you created this town, I could feel it and see it. But and every time, because even talking about where Odette was, because I spent so long living in Sydney, I was trying to make it Redfern, because that's what I was thinking. And I couldn't. I actually had to stop and go, that's actually, he's not saying Redfern. You need to stop that, you know.
And it's interesting what you say about the town. So I did spend some time in a town and walked around, and I'll just give you a sense of the idea of place. But what I did when I was in the town, this was the start of the novel. So people often say, well, how does this novel start as an idea? I was in this country town, and what I actually noticed is that there had been a levee built in the 1920s to protect the top end of the town, or the main street with all its fine buildings, from any floods from the river. What that meant, of course, is that the people who could afford to live in the town were protected from floods, but those who lived in the flat side of the town, and where there were a few sort of factories and stuff, is that not only were they more vulnerable, because the levee was built, it meant that they were more likely to be flooded out and suffer greater. And that's where poor white people lived and the local Aboriginal community lived. So that was the first idea about a town has a division that is identified through this levee, which I made the line, Dean's line, in the book. But one of the things that I did is that I took a lot of photographs, but when I came back to Melbourne, I actually created a physical map.
Oh, really?
So I drew a large map. And people say, why didn't you put it in the book? I say, because I'm not a cartographer and it would look really bad. But I had a map, and it was really important to me, because so when I think of which way Odette might walk to the mission, where Sissy might ride her bike, where Millie might live, all of those had to seem plausible. So I had the map in front of me. So by the time I think I was finished the first draft, I could see the town, and I could have drawn a map of the town. So you can't, well, I couldn't just conjure it in my head. I had to have that relationship between the real place I'd visited and then the physical map that I drew. And I do that a lot with my work. So I've just started a novel set in Melbourne, in the city, in the CBD. And I know the city back to front. I've always lived close to the city, and I know I must have walked every street of the CBD many times. But even that, a few weeks ago, I went in the city, I started taking photographs. Because the novel begins sort of around dusk in winter, I went in dusk in winter, took photographs. I actually believe that there's a really strong case for going in place. And in other words, a story is always being performed in place. And if you go and do observational work, you will find something. And the writer who thinks, well, I don't need to go there because I can conjure it all in my head, or that's possible. But I actually love to hang out, so that when I did my novel Ghost River in 2015, I would know the section of the Virarung, the Yarra River that I set it like back to front, because I'd spent all my teenage years there, and even as an adult, I spent time there. During the writing of that novel, I reckon I walked that part of the river once a week for a year, and I just picked up little gems that found their way into the book that I would have missed if I hadn't gone down there.
But it's that detail, I think, that is so, like, it creates such a space that the reader is in, and everything becomes tactile then.
Yeah. You've got to think of a three-dimensional. I mean, look, I heard a couple of the comments before about the simple but beautiful aspect of the prose. Two things are really important to me. One is that people do talk about my work as being cinematic, and I know that can be a cliche, but I do visualize all of my work so that I think about it three-dimensionally. If I'm having characters move or act, I actually choreograph it sometimes, so my family see me doing crazy things and, yeah, what's he doing over there? But I'm actually imagining how someone's body is moving. So a lot of my work, I mentioned how bodies interact, so that in a lot of the intimate scenes between Sissy and Odette, I'm interested in that. So when Odette gives Sissy a bath and washes her hair, I could think about, because I have 4 daughters and I've washed all their hair many times. They don't let me do it now, they're adults. But I could convey that, so that is very strong. And the other thing is about language, is that, you know, I have had a couple of people who don't like my work, say the language is too simple, and I don't worry about that. And the only implication of that is, what does it mean I can't write in a complex way? I'm an academic. I can write the most esoteric academic jargon that, you know, you could imagine. In my fiction, I want to write simple, open prose that I hope is accessible for readers, you know, from the age of 14 to 80. And I don't see myself as a writer who wants to have a particular readership. And I think if you trust your readership, and I have a very particular readership, they want you to have that engagement with them. So I like the notion of simplicity, and I think it allows a reader, I actually do think it's a more democratic relationship with a reader, because there's so much they can do to fill that space rather than be just receivers of language.
I think that's it. And Lisa has just mentioned that the story is complex and the language is actually immersive, because you're allowing people.
Can Lisa send me that so I can put that shout line on the next edition?
Oh, well, how about mate from Rosa? I could not put the book down. I think it's Australia's To Kill a Mockingbird. Great respect for Tony and his writing. So there you go.
Well, it's interesting because I'll give you and the audience an insight where someone's potential, and you know, I don't worry about critics, someone's potential negativity is such a gift. Someone didn't like one of my novels, Blood, and actually felt a need to email me and tell me how much he didn't like it. And he said, when I read Blood, I thought it was a cross between The Sopranos and Play School. And I thought, that's a gift. That should have been on the front cover.
Give that to your publicist. They'll run with it.
Yeah. That needs to go on the next billboard advertising.
I reckon.
Now, Tony, we're almost at the end of our time, and I was wondering if you would mind reading from the book. I mean, and you probably heard earlier, my experience of reading The White Girl again was, you know, it was almost like for me, it was almost written like an oral history in some ways, because as I was reading it, I was what your prose for me and the way you've set this story up, it's kind of magnificent in the way that it's so apt to be read out loud. Like it's a really, it feels right. Like there's so many books you read that it wouldn't even occur to you to have it read out loud because it's not written for that. But I had a real sense that your book is. And then when we heard you reading it recently, it was lovely, and I was hoping that you could share that with.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because there is an audio version of the book which I didn't do, but I think it does lend itself to being heard, and that I mean the audio version is actually great to listen to. Okay, so I'm just going to read quite a short piece, and I did mention it just briefly earlier about the bath. I always refer to this as the bath scene, and I'm going to use this joke one more time. It's not like a Hitchcock movie. When you say the bath scene, you think of the shower scene. It's a very lovely bath scene, and it was written, so it's early in the book, and it was really to set up for the reader about, pretty simply, there's so much love here between Odette Brown and her granddaughter. And as you used the word earlier, it's portrayed and conveyed in a very tactile way. So I'll just read it. It's very self-explanatory. Odette found Sissy busy arranging wood in a fire pit beside the cast iron bath. She knocked on the window to get her granddaughter's attention. Sissy looked up and smiled. When she was satisfied the fire was ready to be lit, she washed her hands under the backyard tap and walked into the kitchen. Good morning, Nana. She hugged her grandmother. Good morning to you too. Have you had your breakfast? Odette asked. Yes, Sissy said. I had some bread and jam, and after I got out of bed, I felt hungry again. What about you? Odette brushed Sissy's fringe away from her eyes and tucked it behind her ear. I'm not surprised you're hungry. You've been out there working hard. Take your jumper off and I'll make you a sandwich. But you walked all the way to the graveyard and back, Nan. That's harder work than I've been doing. Odette felt pain in the side of her body and grimaced. What's wrong? Sissy asked. Odette dismissed Sissy's question. There's nothing wrong with me, young miss. She picked up a box of matches and went into the backyard. Sissy had prepared a good fire. Odette lit the match, stood back and watched as the flames quickly took to the timber. She went back into the kitchen and made lunch. After they'd eaten, Sissy got up from the table and looked out of the window to the bath. I reckon it's ready, Nan. It's my turn to spread the coals and heat the water. That's a lot of hard work, Odette said, but don't let me stop you. You can have first bath today, Nan. Odette wouldn't hear of it. No, it won't be. No, I won't be. You always go first, and that's the way we'll keep it. Odette was in the laundry struggling to saw through a rock-hard block of velvet soap when Sissy called out to her, I'm ready, Nan. Until the previous summer, Odette had always helped wash and dry Sissy at bath time. But now that her granddaughter was developing, Odette left the girl to enjoy some privacy until it was time to wash her hair. She came out of the laundry carrying a tin pail, a hairbrush, and a bottle of castor oil. She moved a wooden chair alongside the tub, sat down and dipped the pail into the water. Pass me the soap, Sissy, and put your head back. Sissy closed her eyes and rested her neck against the edge of the bath. Odette gently poured the warm water over Sissy's head, her hair darkening as the water ran onto her shoulders. Odette massaged Sissy's scalp, working the soap into a rich lather. She then rinsed Sissy's hair with several pails of water, poured a few drops of castor oil into one hand and raked the oil through Sissy's hair with her fingers. Sissy sighed with pleasure. Oh, I love this, Nana. It's the best time of the week. I'm happy you do, Odette smiled, because I love it too.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you. Yeah. All right.
That bloody velvet soap was like a rock, wasn't it? I used to get it in these big yellow, what do we call it, like loaves of them? And I remember you had to cut them.
It was actually like a loaf, and my mum used it for everything from washing in the sink to washing the hair to wash. And literally, people, if I said this to my 5 children, they'll get out the violin, Michael. But we used to get a cheese grater, and she would get a block of velvet soap and grate the soap into the washing machine. So it was used for everything. And when the good thing about velvet soap, when you put it on your face, I don't know what was in it, but it made your face sort of light up. It would turn bright red.
Do you have one of those
a
handle thing that you put it in and then flush it around?
Oh, you tried telling kids that people used to get a little wire thing for the little bits of the bit ends of soap to save it. They won't believe you.
I think we should stop, Michael, because these young people, if they're listening in, they'll shoot a baby boomer.
Oh, yeah.
There'll be a boomer.
Linda, just some feedback. Linda, that was fantastic. Lovely to hear the words out loud. Valerie says, my mum still uses a velvet soap. Such memories. And Barbie, the bath scene is exquisite. Thank you so much, Tony. That was so good to hear.
And Len has just said that he actually went to high school with you, Tony, and he would like to congratulate you on yet another great book. And you make him proud to call you a mate, and he's proud of your achievements. Keep up the great work.
I know who that is. That's young Lenny Pertain from Richmond High School, the class of '69. How you going, Len? Keep well.
Oh, and hang on. Perhaps the final comment from one Grace Birch. Killed it, Dad.
Yeah, she's my media. Grace is my
your Instagram.
Grace is my media manager.
She does a great job.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.
I look dancing to the Water Boys.
Yeah. Please thank you for having me, and thank all the audience. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much, Tony. Over to you, Brooke.
Yes, I just would like to thank everyone for coming along to our very first book club. And as I've said at the beginning, we're going to send out an email to you all at the end. And I'd really like some feedback on what you thought did or didn't work from this format. And of course, I want to thank Tony for, being so generous with his time and being our first man up. Thank you.
Man up. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.